Ready.
Fable. When she grew very old, Medusa decided to give her true heart away. It was, of course, made of stone. She was again very old and unlovely, though not in an unhandsome way. She saved up her courage to ask the moon if she might come for a visit and clear her head. This country, she wrote, this country is a disaster. The gay bars play the history channel. Stream of consciousness turns out to be a gutter. She packed light other than her heart. She had no particular needs, only to find a starman to explain to him the desperate scene. The moon was put out and shrank to a sliver. The Medusa drank ouzo and signed for all deliveries. She turned a few satellites to stone, but her heart, forgive the pun, wasn't in it. No suitable starman came. The Medusa decided to die. She found an asteroid for a grave. She gave her heart to the moon before leaving. The moon typically did not know whether to be irritated or relieved. They said their goodbyes. Shortly thereafter, the moon contracted an incurable disease.
Unless someone wants to start the discussion of the poem.
I'm going to volunteer.
Okay, grab the microphone, Maria.
So before we read the poem, we had a private aside where we were discussing the first woman translator of Homer, and also an article that I read discussing Medusa and talking about how Athena actually saved Medusa, and it wasn't a punishment for her rape in a temple, but instead Athena gave her the tools with which to fight against that rape to ensure it would never happen again. So that's kind of right now. Anybody else want to do first?
One reason I came tonight was when I read the poem in Richard's email, it reminded me of one of my favorite novels, which I've read many times. It's called Chimera by Joan Barth. And that's a novel divided into 3 parts. And one part is about Scheherazade, one is about Bellerophon, and one is about Perseus. But it's about what becomes this strange love affair between Perseus and Medusa is simultaneously Athena. It's very complicated, and I can't possibly really reproduce what Barth did, but it makes you feel very differently about Medusa, and this poem made me feel the same way.
One of the things that I was quite intrigued by, and again, this poem is then discussed in the blog post, so there's a kind of extension to the analysis, which I guess I initiated, but I like the question of her being old was going back to the origin story as well of Medusa, that she, what happens if you take a myth and continue it and not just stop at the moment of kind of the iconic transition and this kind of thing. And I think it is Carol Ann Duffy, the poet, who kind of imagines the literal manifestation of these things. And one of my favorite ones by her is Mrs. Midas. And so the idea of, having to live with a man who everything he touches turns to gold, and the infuriation of that process of him like trying to keep his hands off of everything and destroying everything. And actually Midas was something that I thought about with Medusa when I read this as well. One thing I did not understand in this poem, and that's why I emailed the poet, was many of the references to the moon and to the stars, and I have some of her replies for you, but I will save those just for a little bit to let us kind of think about the poem as it stands. What I was curious about, we have several classicists here, and I was invited you all mainly to get your impressions of this work, but also, as Maria said as well, this idea of interpreting this poem as one, or the myth of Medusa as one that is either seen as fundamental to certain kind of patriarchal traditions in Greece. This is a misogynistic myth, at the same time seeing ways of interpreting it as countering a kind of patriarchal narrative, like in the work of Elena Cizou, the laugh of Medusa. So I was just wondering about, do you feel if this poem leans either way in terms of its grounding itself in a patriarchal discourse, or do you feel like it's already part of the kind of counter narrative?
I would say counter-narrative, because one, protagonist is Medusa. Well, Medusa is often the antagonist, or often version of Perseus, and she's an antagonist whose death must lead to the salvation of other people. But also that she's the protagonist and she's old, and women don't get to get old, usually, in stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's a counter. Disagree.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but that makes me think of something else that happened this past week. I'm publishing a book on Greek myths, and a week and a half ago the press sent me the cover, which was not at all the cover I suggested. It was a sketch by, I don't know who, I think a Renaissance artist. And in the foreground, it showed Andromeda chained to the rock with prominently the chains on her wrists. And then in the background, it showed Perseus coming to rescue her on Pegasus. And Andromeda is like this, turned upward with her mouth open, beseeching Perseus. And I wrote to my editor and said, I'm not having that on my cover. This is a drawing that shows a woman prominently in a situation of having absolutely no agency and waiting for a man to rescue her. So there was some back and forth on this, and they finally conceded that they would do something else. And the second cover I got, which I've decided to accept because you can't keep fighting forever, is John Singer Sargent's aesthetically beautiful mural that's on the ceiling of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts that shows the beheading of Medusa. And even though it's illustrative in its nature, it's quite gory. You see the blood gushing out of the neck as he holds up the head, and you see the splayed body in this very odd, almost impossible situation of the limbs. And then in back of Perseus, you see Athena with her face lit up with joy. And so a kind of muted version of this is now the background of my book. And I thought, well, yeah, I guess it's better than Andromeda chained to the rock, but I'm not sure I'm in total agreement with this picture of Medusa as my cover either. So I don't know where that's going, but Medusa has been very, very much in my thoughts for the last week and a half, let's put it that way. So this is a very well-timed discussion.
That's interesting.
As to well-timed, the Met in New York, has a show on Medusa just now.
Okay.
I just got the catalog, and it's written by a former student of mine. What intrigued me and what I found exciting is there's a long part on Medusa, and then there's a second part on the sirens. The sirens are sort of the anti-Medusa, the women who have agency for a while until they run into Odysseus. And so in the end, the anti-Medusa, the sirens have the same fate as the Medusa has. And so I found the parallel very striking. I never thought about that in that way. The sirens going against and together with Medusa.
Well, actually, most of the Greek monsters are female. The cover I asked for, I later realized was just as bad. What I wanted was John Singer Sargent's drawing, also on the ceiling of the MFA, of Heracles killing the Hydra. And then I started to think, Hydra, actually that's female too. So I'm not sure how often we get away from that.
In terms of the sirens, this chapter on myth and other peccadillos, I was thinking about myth and misogyny and the siren. You know, a lot of contemporary artists engage with the sirens, and a lot of female artists kind of go back to them. And not only the sirens, but Echo as well. And it feels like maybe Echo, maybe in the story of Narcissus and Echo, when she falls in love with him, but he's too obsessed with himself, so then just can repeat the last words that he says. It's a question of voice, like it is in the sirens, but there's a kind of limit put on her power, and it seems like Medusa, the sirens, and Echo were coming together in this chapter. What was interesting for me was that I didn't have Medusa in this chapter until I started thinking about preparing for today and discussing more Claudia LaRocca's work made it more apparent that Medusa belonged in a chapter, not so much on... I thought she was going to be there in terms of the way different media becomes a way to transmit ancient mythology and contemporary art, moving from stone to the way she's appropriated to talk about writing by Sisu. So I was kind of intrigued by how Medusa became part of a narrative of sexism, basically. In the book, I mean, obviously I knew that she was a myth about this, but in the book I wasn't sure that she would end up in this chapter. So those connections are really, really interesting. We have about 3 more minutes of the first part of the triptych. No. Okay. Yeah, of course. We can abandon the mic. I mean, we can make that decision. How do we feel like abandoning the microphone? We're ready for that? Does anyone who hasn't spoken want the mic because they haven't had it yet? Okay.
Why does Mary Beard say that we can't use Medusa? Are we doing the mic?
I'm just doing this as a gesture.
Why? I haven't read Mary Beard's latest Women in Power.
But, yeah.
Said that Mary Beard, so Medusa, could no longer be used as a symbol for anything for like female empowerment. What was her argument? Or you all read it?
I read it, but I don't remember her saying that.
So this was in the context of the appropriation of Caravaggio's Medusa, where it has been used in Photoshop with Angela Merkel's head as well as Hillary Clinton's head. And there's actually even the sculpture, I'm trying to remember the sculpture, it's a very famous sculpture, I should know, like neoclassical sculpture of Perseus and Medusa with holding up the head and then the body of Medusa being trampled underfoot, which sounds similar to the David. Yeah, it was Cellini, yeah, exactly. So there's a Cellini sculpture and there's a iconography of Trump as Perseus holding the kind of screaming face of Hillary Clinton. And Mary Beard's argument was that she goes back to the aegis of Athena and shows that this was fundamentally a misogynistic myth, and then shows that even attempts to reclaim it are unsuccessful because it still persists, basically. So it was something about that kind of persistence, and also the fact that this was an image that was seemingly acceptable as well. It wasn't some really extreme version of something. It seemed like showing a woman's head screaming with snakes seemed like everyone's kind of happy with that. It's not just an intense extreme version. It seemed, and Mary Beard talks about the way this was on people's T-shirts. This was an image that could be kind of encouraged somehow. Well, we can transition to the second part, but I need someone to take over the camera duties. Who's willing to sit here with the camera? Thanks, Amber.